everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you hear some chewing in the background, that is my sweet baby angel dog chewing his favorite toy on the couch. He's fine. Welcome back. Thank you so much for tuning into another video with me. So today I have something kind of interesting on the docket. So I've been kind of wanting to do an in-depth analysis of a classic body of work for a minute now. Like I've said before in the past, I typically like to read mostly adult contemporary books with a few YA thrown in the mix. But as a literary major, I do have a special place in my heart for classics. I've read quite a few at this point due to being in some English literature classes that I've taken so far. So I've had a chance to get acquainted with some classic literature and get my take on them. So I read one piece of literature last year that really stuck with me, and that is Kate Chopin's The Awakening. Now obviously this is a very multifaceted story with a lot of subcontext that we could dig into, and I will try to get into as much as I can, but I also don't want to make this a 45-minute video or a full-on lecture. So these are just some of my thoughts on the body of work, on Kate Chopin, on her writing style, and on the metaphors that I found quite interesting in The Awakening. So let's get started. So the story is set in late 18th century, early 19th century, and it focuses on the Pontellier family, specifically on the protagonist Edna Pontellier. She is the wife of Léonce Pontellier and the mother of 2 children. She and her family are staying in their summer home in Louisiana, along with a couple of their friends. Edna, as the main character, has a lot of emotion that she keeps beneath the surface. She feels really unhappy in her marriage. She doesn't really want to be a mother. And she has this longing for a passionate life that she just hasn't been able to fulfill in the one that she's been given. She feels very depressed and has a lot of feelings of detachment from her family and from the life that she's living. She doesn't feel that same twinge of maternal instinct like her other friends who are vacationing there feel with their children, and she also doesn't feel this call to be the world's greatest wife. Chopin shapes Edna as a woman seeking fulfillment outside of the conventional norms that are offered to women in the late 1890s, specifically women of wealth. She starts spending time with a young man at the summer home named Robert Lebrun, and soon starts fantasizing about having an affair with him. Throughout the book, we see that Edna is having, as the title suggests, an awakening of her spirit and of her passion. So she decides to start making changes in her life, changes that will give her a life of self-sufficiency. This includes moving out of her home, taking up painting, and having erotic encounters with men. I mean, it's the 18th century, so you can guess that erotic encounters are probably a little more prude than what you're imagining, but still, very steamy stuff. In the end, Edna finally gets a chance to have this romantic encounter and affair with Robert. However, it fizzles out quickly, and in the end, Edna takes her own life, or so people debate. This we'll get to in a moment. However, the story in short is essentially an awakening of a woman transforming herself from an imprisoned person in a life that she may not have wanted for herself from the beginning into someone who takes control of her life. Whether that is a good or bad decision is up to the reader to decide. So, I have some interesting thoughts on this body of work because I absolutely loved it. It's definitely a very feminist read, which can sound weird since it's written in such a strange time where feminism wasn't exactly a movement that was getting a lot of traction. However, historians actually called this time period the women's era of the 1890s, as talk of women's rights regarding property ownership, education, and personal fulfillment, and influencing art and culture were spreading across the country. Interestingly enough, Kate Chopin was actually raised by 3 generations of independent women, giving her bodies of work lots of feminist undertones. She frequently wrote with veiled commentary on the treatment of women and focused on the strength of the female characters in her work. Now many debate whether Edna Pontellier was written from an angle of an oppressed feminist or a woman who was suffering from psychosis. However, given a lot of evidence and contextual history with Kate Chopin, one can most likely assume that she was writing it from a point of view to express the desire of women to have independent lives. The way that Chopin focuses on Edna's choices to make personal decisions in her life, like moving out of her home and beginning to paint and starting to have close relationships with women. Y'all don't mind if Dookie joins the party, right? He's gonna hang out with us for a little bit. By giving Edna Pontellier in this body of work the option of making her own decisions, even if it went against cultural norms of what married women were supposed to do in that time, it really represents that she feels that women should have forward motion. Chopin highlights the importance of self-awareness and independent thought. making note that emotional freedom is going to be really important for women in the future, as we obviously see now. Interestingly, we also see Chopin talk about the right to choose with women. By right to choose, I mean right to choose their life. Maybe I should have chose better words for that. Chopin also highlights that there's not one right way to have a life as a woman in this story, by bringing in these other main characters that interact so intimately with Edna Pontellier, one of which is Edna's close friend, Adele Ratignol. Or at least I think that's how you pronounce it. It's a very French Cajun name, so I'm not 100% sure, but that's how my white ass is gonna pronounce it, okay? Adele is kind of shrouded in this angelic light throughout the book. She's typically dressed in all white, and she's always doing these really wonderful, loving, selfless things for her family. She knits winter clothes for her children during the summertime. She's always available for her husband, and even becomes pregnant as if it's her duty during the summer to bear more children. However, as the story unfolds, you can see that Adele is actually someone who's acutely aware of her sexuality and uses it as a tool of power in her life. She frequently breaks away from the stereotypical characteristics of a domesticated woman, like engaging in explicitly intimate conversations with her friends, even male friends, using her beauty to control Robert in regards to Edna, and even has a sensuous, kind of homoerotic moment with Edna Pontellier on the beach. I mean, it's 18th century literature, so you do have to do some imagining here. A touch of a hand and the slight cozying up to someone's bosom is essentially like watching pornography in a book. But alas, it does mean something in literature. I think that Chopin wrote Edna's friend Adele this way to represent that there's no one right way to be a woman in today's society, or in that society as well. Gender roles put us in a box, and Adele is breaking out of that box by being someone that doesn't have one simple role. Yes, she's a mother, and yes, she's a friend, and yes, she's a wife. But she's also a little wild, she's also a little sexy, she's also really risky. These are some of the things that she writes into this character to really show that there's no one right way to be a woman. And I also think this is supposed to be a really good opposite. Oh my god, look at his face, he's so cute. Sorry. I also think Kate Chopin wrote Adele this way so it could be a good opposite of what Edna Pontellier is experiencing. Adele has accepted her life and molded it around her views and her love to be able to make it work for her, while Edna feels extremely trapped in what she's in. Also really interesting to the text is the use of local color and naturalism in Chopin's writing. Obviously, this book has a lot of sexual implications, even though not a lot of sexual moments happen within the book. However, speaking of adultery and sexuality at this time in literature was almost condemned by everyone. On top of all that already hot and heavy literature, Chopin builds a world around this story that only emphasizes the tension and the sexuality and the heat behind it. As I said before, it's set in New Orleans during the summertime, so there's already that humid feel, a lot of lush green that's written into the story that you can picture with your mind. It's by the ocean, so there's obviously this sort of kind of tropical sense, even though it's not necessarily a tropical area. Things are written with a kind of lush description to kind of make something feel delicious and almost sinful. The setting alone just brings people into a moment where they can be intimate together, creating more of this sultry engagement with one another. So I think Chopin used that writing style for a purpose, to really get across her ideas of sexual freedom and sexual ambiguity. Using this hot breath setting, everything kind of melts together, just the way that Edna's sexuality kind of melts together later on in the story, with her sexual indiscretions with other men, as well as her desire to be more of a sexual being. I also think it's supposed to feel almost a little suffocating with everything being so hot. By hot, I mean the setting, obviously, as well as, you know, the literature itself. Kind of like when it gets so hot you feel like you can't breathe, kind of reflected into the literature as well. Because Edna, even with all these sexual advances and this freedom that she's finding, she still doesn't feel fulfilled in her desires. She still finds herself unable to find romantic satisfaction or find peace in her assertions of, you know, sexuality. I think that through the eyes of Edna, Chopin puts a lot of value on sexual freedom during this specific period of time. That was a bad stutter. That's okay. And finally, the big thing I really wanted to talk about with the story has to do with Edna's supposed suicide at the end of the story. This has been debated by scholars, authors, publishers, all since its publication. Critics love to tear through this part of the story, with people who are probably a little more liberal and more feminist are going to side with the opposite side, saying that the suicide isn't actually what happened, but it's more of a metaphor. So the novel ends with Edna going to the Grand Isle beach by herself. She strips off all of her clothes until she's naked and then starts going into the water where she's ultimately going to die. So critics have viewed this as Edna's inability to look at herself from a point of self-awareness. She's unable to see that her true self is unobtainable. Humans are constantly shifting and growing. However, a lot of people also feel like this ending is supposed to be metaphorical for freedom from the life that we feel we are imprisoned by. Chopin was actually known for her use of symbolism in her literature. And in the story, she actually uses bird-like imagery to talk about emotional and mental freedom. Chopin uses a caged bird at the beginning of the story to represent Edna being stuck in her proverbial cage, I guess you could say. That her life feels like a prison and that she's just peeking through the bars. As Edna starts to begin to explore freedom from her husband and from her children and starts to throw away societal norms that she's supposed to keep up with, she moves out of the home she made with her husband into what's called a pigeon house. The pigeon house makes space for Edna to breathe and eventually have freedom of her own to pursue her own desires. And finally, at the end of the book, when she's having these thoughts as she's dying, there is a metaphor about a flying bird in the sky. Those who support this theory feel that that bird is supposed to represent Edna freed from her life, untethered from the inescapable restrictions of society and her domesticated life. So her suicide feels like it's almost the last act of free will that she can do. I think Chopin wrote this ambiguous ending to start a conversation with her readers. It's there to inspire contemplation and radically progress discussions about women's freedoms and rights in that time period. Interestingly, this story actually wasn't very popular until about the 1970s. And since then, the story's been regarded as a tale of a feminist's rise to independence and liberation. I think Chopin writes with this air of raw honesty to show that life as a woman isn't always so cut and dry as a lot of 18th century literature is going to paint them as. All in all, I absolutely loved this story. I thought it was so well thought out, and the context underneath all of that literature has so many ideas that I support 100%. I definitely identify as a feminist myself, so a lot of those ideas that are being shared with the story I find really progressive and actually helpful to read as a woman in today's society. There is no one right way to be a woman, but there is a wrong way to live your life. And if you're not living true to yourself and going after what you love, then you are going to be suffering. You are going to feel like you're in a trap. So I just love it. I thought it was fantastic. I could talk so much more about this because there's so much meat to chew on and to talk about, but I will leave that for now so I'm not boring you guys to death with a ton of literature analysis. But I would highly recommend this book to anyone who's wanting to read something a little more on the classic level, but still wants something that they feel can relate to their life today, especially if you are reading this as a woman. But that's all I got for you today. I really hope that you guys like this story. I feel so passionate about it, and I definitely want to read more stories like this. So if you have anything to recommend that you think I should read that is like The Awakening that I would enjoy, let me know in the comments below. I'm always trying to add stuff to my TBR list, so the more I can do that, the better. So that wraps it up for today's video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up please, and subscribe. I always want to get new subscribers so I can share all of my thoughts, all of my crazy, annoying, stupid thoughts with you guys. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.